Okay, we're back and live in the virtual studio with George Gantz, my good friend and fellow philosopher, mathematician, and I don't know, maybe a little bit of a mentor, George, because yeah, you're going to say shucks, but you know what, George? It's actually our conversation so far have been really wonderful, and I think you got a lot going on upstairs and in the heart. So and I hope that resonates with people because I know it has with me.
Well, I can say the same for you, Daniel. It's a great friendship, and I really appreciate the chance to chew on these issues and think about the big issues. And hopefully, in our tiny little way, we push the ball forward in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, for anybody just tuning in, we're focusing on chapter 4 of E.O. Wilson's Consilience, and I think both of us kind of took a breather in that at various different points in that chapter um, to think about what E.O. Wilson is trying to convey, maybe some of his assumptions and his insinuations about the direction of science, its capabilities, the limitations, and for me at least, um, I take a real pause in trying to be overly critical about it because it actually is encouraging that challenging thought. I thought, this is the mark of a good author too, right? You want to write something that people are not just taking as doctrine, and there's a subtle art of being able to do that. So he's taken us all the way to chapter 4 through an Ionian enchantment. He's brought up and set the stage through the Enlightenment, and here we are now, I think, at the beginning of the synthesis.
Well, yeah, he's struggling though because the chapter before was about the Enlightenment and all the values of rationalism, and then the way it fell apart in the French Revolution, and then there's a thread of continental philosophy that goes off, and so he's actually discouraged. And in this chapter, he talks about that as kind of, all right, we had what he characterizes as the end of the Enlightenment, because that belief in the power of human imagination and science to carry us forward with pure rationality, failed. But in this chapter, he talks about how that was, threads were resurrected after, and he talks about particularly the advances in mathematics and logic and the logical positivism that had this faith and belief. Okay, we can do this. We've got this rationality. We can put it together. We can codify it in terms of axiomatic presentations and logical steps, and we can regain what he felt had been lost previously. But then he complains about the fact that, gee whiz, most people, philosophers and people don't seem to believe that we can have faith in this objective reality. And so he argues strenuously about there is an objective reality, and the way to get access to that is through the empirical sciences. And so it's a very he tells it in kind of this great epic narrative. He uses language that's interesting and that's engaging, and yet at the same time it reveals his own internal belief structure, faith structure, and the biases that lead him to make certain conclusions. But it's a great chapter and a good read, and it was very interesting to revisit.
Well, it's a really interesting jump as to him being, in my opinion, one of the greatest intellectuals of our time. I'm so impressed with E.O. Wilson. However, the foundation of what E.O. Wilson, his substrate, his religious substrate is evangelical, right? And so he does acknowledge it. But it seems to be a growing kind of trend of acknowledgement that says culturally I identify with it, but that's about it. So the romantic sort of approach to it, I agree with. Doctrinal sort of types of things. I'll say science, takes a commanding approach to his worldview, and I definitely think that I can be sympathetic with that approach, right? And if I wanted to be very humble about it, it probably reveals some of my bias and some of my vulnerability to the equation, and it says something like this. It says, and I don't know. I don't need to be careful here, but I want to kind of point out the difference that as I was reading this and going through this material, I was keeping my good friend George in mind while I was rereading chapter 4. I've read this book multiple times, but never in the company of a virtual reading like we're doing. And with the buttress of your essay, I want to read a little bit of an opening that I think you included in the conclusion of your essay, and it was the following quote from the Persian thinker Omar Khayyam. I think it's really quite interesting, and mathematician, right? So maybe
yes.
So it goes like this. It says, "There was a door to which I found no key. There was a veil through which I might not see. Some little talk a while of me and thee there was, and then no more of thee and me." The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, verse, I think 17. But anyways, this, so to me, there's a couple things going on in that. I mean, other than the translation into English, which beyond that, the culture we can't quite assimilate, right, into the Persian language and the feel and the rhythm and
and F. Scott Fitzgerald did a magnificent job, because he's the one that translated it. He brought it into the popular, vernacular with his translation, and he did a wonderful job of creating in English some of the alliterations, mystical, cosmological kinds of questioning that my understanding is part of that strong Islamic tradition, and for which Omar Khayyam was noted. But it's ancient. His being in the whatever it was, 11th century. We don't have a whole lot of historical information about it. So it's gone through a long journey of being cultivated in languages that we're not familiar with. Fitzgerald translated it, and now that translation is the one that people are quite familiar with. And that epigraph, I use that as an epigraph for an essay that I submitted to the Foundational Questions Institute on, uncertainty, undecidability, and incompleteness. And the thread of the FQXI contest was, these are some mysteries that we have out here that empirical science hasn't been able to really nail down. And, so what do we make of this? And I felt that quatrain from the Rubaiyat sort of captured that essence of, there seems to be a door that we have no key. And if you look at 20th century logical thought, and particularly the incompleteness theorems of Kurt Gödel, it kind of says, any logical system is either complete or consistent. And we want our logic to be consistent, so we place that value first. We want to be consistent in the way we think. We don't want to think opposites. If it's consistent, then there are statements that can't be proved. There are things that are undecidable. So you have naturally a system that is incomplete and for which you do not know all the truths. It can't prove all the truths. So that is like there's a door there. We want the truth, but we don't have a key to get into it because of these constraints on the side of logic. And then in terms of the veil through which we cannot see, to me, that speaks to the whole concept of uncertainty and quantum the paradoxes in quantum physics that says, look, you get down to a certain size in the universe. I think we talked about this last time in terms of Planck space and Planck time, and you can't look beyond that. So that's a bit of a veil that is impossible to actually look through and see on the other side. And then we get to the issue of consciousness, and that's the talk of thou, you and me. Talking is the exercise of consciousness and thinking about that process. And and then what does that really show us? Again, uncertainty, things that can't be figured out, and I think there's a thread that says they will never be figured out because of the recursive nature of these processes. So that's a great answer, if you will, or a response to the kind of unblinkered faith that E.O. Wilson carries into his thinking. Even though the threads of the entitlement, fell apart in the French Revolution, by his account, got reconstituted by the logical positivism and the thrust of this great positive emphasis on science in the early part of the 20th century. He doesn't really want to believe in the facts that are coming out of that exploration: uncertainty, undecidability, incompleteness, complexity, emergent phenomenon, all of these things. And he was quite familiar with that because of his work as an entomologist, but it just doesn't feel right. And so he has to hold on to this image of science as the pathway to perfect understanding of an objective reality that we have claim on. So it's a big statement on his part. He does it with great passion and great language, and you have to respect it. But my point is that some of these questions that he's thinking can be addressed empirically can't, and that's something that we have to face up to.
Right. Okay. I mean, I even have a bit of an abrasion to to framing it that way too, George, because on one hand I do understand, but my with your perspective, but the idea is that it feels like we're just let's know when to put the parking brake on and stop, right? And let's say that we've reached the limit with science and just go, all right, we're done. Guys, we've arrived. Now let's stop. Right. That's how it has a feeling I know that's not entirely what you're saying, but some threads, you are saying it in a few counterfactuals. You're saying, look, this plan and this vision forward, let's maybe start to consider that there's aspects of our knowledge that have reached the finish line and that we can't actually bridge the gap anymore, right? That there's an end to this knowledge, right, structure, right?
Yeah, and that's I think may be true in certain areas or disciplines of science. I think one of the examples is the standard particle model of chemistry. Beautiful structural model, from hydrogen all the way up to the heavy elements, and how they work and their orbital structures. And I think that is a task of science, or a body of science, that's pretty well understood and known in a certain category of information and knowledge. And as a matter of fact, they've gone out and manufactured the highest elements of the periodic table that don't appear in science because they're too ephemeral to appear in science. And so there's a body of knowledge that seems to be pretty intact and complete, and maybe in a certain sense we're done with that, so that can go into the high school textbooks and we don't have to worry about it. Quantum physics isn't that way.
Yeah, that's
quantum
right.
Physics is self-contradictory, and I believe it's self-contradictory in part because of the recursive nature of quantum phenomena, where the observer is part of the observation. You can't disentangle the observer from the observation, and that runs into the same kinds of recursive problems that Gödel's incompleteness theorem does. So, it's a rather technical argument, but the point is that's an area where I don't think it is possible to bridge those divides. I think we're going to find that the universe exists in these areas that they do not appear to be comprehensible, and the only way to get an understanding of it is to step back up to a more metaphysical or mystical level, where you say, yeah, well, empirical science is unbelievably good at doing this and this and this and this and this, but these are areas where we have to turn to a different kind of inquiry, and that's a philosophical inquiry, an inquiry about our faith propositions and what is it that makes sense for us as living human beings.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this autonomic. Is that how I pronounce it? Autonomic or
autonoetic.
Autonoetic. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the framework of those counterfactuals into the past, into the past, and then projected into the future is absolutely beautiful. It's really quite an amazing ability that we have as conscious sapiens, right?
Yes.
And the way I frame an understanding of this particular function is that we have an exaggerated ability with our with our gray matter as it is, right? Right? The constellation between our ears, right? So we have this ability to abstract in such a vast infinite worlds. Literally, we have the ability to do that, right? Now, I would say that
be careful of the word infinite, but yes.
Well, but even coming up with the concept of infinite, right? And an imagined sense of infinite. So this is, yeah. And so to me, the fact that we can even think of it means that it's at least metaphysically real, right?
Yeah.
That sounds so weird to say that, right? It's metaphysically real because it's, but anyway, so we have this ability. We have this ability to imagine it, right? So I think this is the key difference is the extent to which we can abstract reason or form abstractions. And in a couple episodes ago, we were talking about dogs, for example, and I do believe they have an ability to abstract, but just not to the extent that we can abstract, and they don't have the ability to tie it together like Ariadne's string and find a way back through generations other than ways that are non-cultural. So what I mean by that is my little pooches were out in the backyard, and intuitive they know that a snake does certain things, right? Like we don't, nobody taught them to do that, right?
Yeah.
To react to a snake,
or they may have learned how to do that as a process. So yeah, that's interesting, and I think part of the confusion and what I came up with in that essay as I was looking at it, because consciousness is the thing that kind of holds it all together, one way or the other. What are the levels of consciousness? And Dawkins has talked about the hard problem of consciousness being, well, what is that? What the heck is this subjective world? It's interiorly felt, but he thinks that's the hard problem, and the idea that the information processing or cognitive processing that we do as human beings is simply that's solvable. You can do that with computer circuitry, so that part is easy. But this thing about the feelings that we have is the hard problem. And I took a slightly different tack, because if you look at the level of consciousness, there is a level at which there is information processing happening at the very, very finest grains of life, for example, bacterial and even chemicals reacting to their environments, where there's some information processing going on. There's an action, there's a reaction, there's a response. So there is a kind of intelligence, a kind of consciousness in terms of how one entity is responding to the environment. It looks like, they're sensing the environment and they're responding to the environment. And that's a kind of conscious behavior that's anoetic in the
Mm.
vernacular that's come up recently in the psychology profession. So it's anoetic. It's not really an aware consciousness, but it's a functioning consciousness that shows intelligence. And then there's a level where there's some memory process in play and some learning process in play where an organism can evolve, can respond, and can build a memory out of something and respond in accordance with the memory. And there's a higher level of functioning, and that's called the noetic. So it's an awareness of the environment, awareness of the individual responding to that, and ability even to process that into memory and potentially recount it if we were to be able to go into that brain and figure it out. We could see the storyline of this is happening to me, I'm responding in this way, this happens. So there's a learning process that takes place. But that's not all that happens in the human mind. In the human mind, we have the ability to understand that we are the ones having the thoughts and the perceptions, and we're able to observe ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that recursive aspect of human consciousness or sentient consciousness, I think, is the hard problem. And that's the one that is labeled as autonoetic. In other words, self-aware, self-acknowledging, and able to process that level of information. Because when you think about it, I was out hiking with the grandkids over the weekend a little bit, and we happened to talk about an old thing. I don't know if it's a Dr. Seuss book or everything, but I was talking about the bee watchers of Hotch Hotch. I don't know if you're familiar with that children's story, but there's a community of Hotch Hotch, and they have these bees, and they want to protect the bees, so they have the bee watchers to watch over the bees. And then they got concerned about whether the bee watchers were doing a good job of watching the bees. So they had to have watchers over the bee watchers watching the bees. So this ends up being what you could see as an infinite recursion of watchers watching the watchers, watching the watchers, watching the bee watchers of Hotch Hotch, which I think is a lovely process. So the autonoetic ability of human consciousness to look at itself and be aware of itself is analogous to the way Kurt Gödel proved his incompleteness theorems. Because when you have that recursive process going on in either mathematics or the human mind, there are questions that cannot be answered. It invokes a mystical feature of the world, because once you start looking at yourself, you can't ever quite know everything about yourself, because there's always the self that's watching the self. It's a little bit, then a simple analogy is if you think about the reality that we know as a conscious human being is like a balloon, and we're inside the balloon. When you're inside the balloon, you do not know and cannot know what the balloon looks like from the outside. So this is a fundamental, I think it's a fundamental feature of consciousness and a fundamental feature of physical reality and mathematical reality that we have explored in the 20th century in a way that was not accessible to prior generations. And wonderful scientists like E.O. Wilson finds these things to be so uncomfortable that he does not accept that limitation to the ability of empirical science to penetrate to objective reality. So that's a summary of the essay, The Door That Has No Key. And one of the things that doesn't come up in that essay, and one of the things that I loved about chapter 4 is I was there. When I was in my 20s, this was like gold to me. This way of thinking about the objective reality and the perfection of math and science as the way into that objective reality. And once we had that, set of, on the train tracks of empirical science and logic and mathematics, all right, that was it. We would know it all. Mm-hmm. And I think what these more subtle aspects of physics, math, consciousness say is, you can't. And that's a very sobering realization to come to. It can be quite depressing to come to that realization, because you have to sort of give up on this concept of empiricism and the validity of the scientific method to answer all problems and all questions. And it opens the door to realizing that some aspects of human life, need a different kind of approach to get to. So I don't want to distract from, the beauty of this book and what E.O. Wilson has to say in it. And I think, to put it this way, he has a heart of gold. Yeah. He tries to be humble. He really tends to think dispassionately about these, about the bigger issues, but he is wedded to a particular cosmology or cosmological metaphysics about objective reality, and the fact that science is the way for us to get access to that objective reality, and anything else that doesn't satisfy the tests of mathematics and science is simply going to be superstition and and things that we have to run away from and fight against. He actually uses some language in here that was kind of interesting. Where is it? Okay, it's on. My pages don't correspond to yours, so So he says that we have a brain that has been forged through the process of natural selection, and as a result, it's focused on survival, not on understanding the external world. And so that has resulted in these misalignments between the objective world and our own understanding of that world, because it's imperfect, because it's based on natural selection. But science gives us access to the perfect way of accessing that objective world. And then when he says, no one should suppose that objective truth is impossible to obtain, even when the most committed philosophers, he'd probably put me in that category, the most committed philosophers urge us to acknowledge that incapacity. And then he says, in particular, it is too early for scientists, the foot soldiers of epistemology, to yield ground so vital to their mission. It's a beautiful line, but it does invoke the idea that we're kind of, the scientific and empirical enterprise is at war if it's got soldiers and it's not going to yield ground. And, I think that's an unfortunate part of the mindset that E.O. Wilson has about the idea that there may be different ways of looking at some of the deeper questions, particularly the metaphysical questions. He's adopted a particular metaphysic about objective reality is it, and the way to it is science. But I think that's missing some of the more mystical aspects of the world and creation and reality that, we really ought to be open to and be willing to talk about. And maybe it's not through the process of science is something that's more philosophical, where we have to be open to that kind of inquiry. And that's one of the purposes to spiral inquiry, is to try and sort through these things and find what are the boundaries between what empirical science does well and can do well, and then where do we have to yield this commitment to objective reality to something that's invites a different way of looking at these things, one that involves one that involves looking at our faith, looking at what that faith is constructed from, and whether that faith is actually valuable in our lives.
George, let me see if I can maybe put something in front of you that might highlight a misinterpretation, kind of. And I don't know, because I want your honest feedback on this. So I look at the larger message from E.O. Wilson on this book and realize that what he's trying to do, the jumping together that he's trying to do, is between the humanities on one side and the scientific endeavor on the other. So the pushback is not really a consilience of sorts between religious thought, right? He's not really, I don't think he's really pushing for that. He's pushing between the arts, and then he's pushing towards the science. And that's where in the institutions, he's getting a lot of pushback. Well, because the interdisciplinary approach, he's not seeing that there's ways for these two to mix. And I'll let you comment here in a second. Whereas I don't think it's really a conversation about science and religion. I think that he's the first to admit that a certain type of church music still moves him to this day. He hasn't jettisoned or stepped away from his evangelical roots. And so if there's someone who has a real strong religious foundation, right, such as yourself in a way, it's like, maybe he's not attacking it in that sort of perspective, right? It's not the overarching of this book of the Consilience was to bring together the biological sciences with the other sciences. Well, no, I mean the other kinds of science, like the humanities, into the sciences. He was trying to mix the two of those. Really, is essentially his project.
Well, I'd say that is correct, but it's also if we'll look at later, some of the later chapters, I think it becomes more obvious that he sees empirical science as the only pathway to understanding.
But for a minute, just say to yourself, like, as you read it, just as the counterpoint with Dan on your shoulder there, right? Yeah. Right. Just say, is it possible that I could that my view would be tempered if I ran this through the heuristic that he's really only trying to do this with academic thought?
Yeah, I don't think that's really the case. I think his language about religion in many places is really quite aggressive.
Okay. So
negative. And also what he's talking about in terms of the consilience of science and the humanities is not a co-equal understanding of how each contributes to human understanding. He actually talks about it in the sense that we will gain a consilience when science is able to functionally explain and characterize everything in the humanities. So it's not a meeting of equals. It's not a jumping together of equals. It's really in a sense, a takeover of more. Now, there are probably some good points that he makes about, and I think he does later, some of the humanities have a tendency to obfuscation and, and fancy language or jargon or more polemic kind of ways of reasoning. Of course, E.O. Wilson does a fair amount of polemics of his own, but and those critiques of humanities are appropriate as a critique of some of the humanities, some of the philosophers that create these incredibly complex conceptual frameworks of idealism and things that seem to be quite detached from the reality of living life as a human being. So, so some of his critiques, I think, are valid critiques about the way some of the humanities have done, and particularly the academic field. But some of the critiques he makes of the academic field, you can also use to critique the field of academic science, because there are some closed minds in that area, and there are people that that use jargon and things to avoid kind of addressing or being able to explain things that a normal human being ought to be able to understand all of this stuff if you just have a good understanding of it, or, a good way to explain it. So his critiques are good, but I wouldn't characterize his Consilience as a equal pairing of knowledge from the humanities and knowledge from empirical science. And nor would I agree that although he can empathize with his past in the evangelical community, I think in terms of the ability of any religion or religious teachings, or call them ancient wisdoms, if you'll accept that, to have any validity in helping us understand how the world works and how we should be living in it. So I think that's the limit to where he goes in his ways of thinking about this, and why sometimes his language comes on pretty dogmatic and pretty strong.
So here's the thing. I think let's just say I put on the chalkboard, big check mark for George. Great. There's a fair criticism, meta criticism, and also highlight in various different aspects of this particular book that says exactly what you've said about E.O. Wilson and his over exuberance, his overemphasis on science as being the pathway forward to reconcile our complete understanding of what it means to be human. I get that. Big check mark. Okay. So what if we just acknowledge that and then move on? And my point is that it comes down to what work you want to do with this text. What is your text? And I mean in general. So I mean from a non-reclusive, how do you battle recursiveness? How do you battle recursiveness? And I'm gonna assert that this is the way you do it, because even in your essay, when you put in, let's see if I can find it here. And it's brilliant, by the way. I really like the way you've framed this with the the various different things of consciousness. And now I can't seem to find it here. Okay, you're saying, and finally, the autonomic self is introspective. Autonomic consciousness exhibits a sense of agency. Autonomic consciousness demonstrates a number of features. The first of that is both dualistic and entangled. So I would focus on that concept of entanglement for a minute, right? And so it brings with a concept of quantum physics. Like that word, really, really reminds me of quantum physics. But I think it's a dangerous, slippery slope to start to frame consciousness and an epistemology of consciousness based off of a word of entanglement, especially if it has it's laden with such contradictions in probability theory and so on and so forth. So I actually keep more of a distance away from that. I'm more of a Einsteinian sort of mind of God does not play dice sort of thing, right? But when I look at that and I look at the words of entanglement, I start to frame in my conceptual understanding of the way the world works is this concept of eusociality, which Wilson is an expert in. And so the eusocial nature that we live in is something that this essay could actually talk more about, because this is how we battle the recursive nature of our existence, is through the eusocial behavior of how we interact in a relational database. Someone might be thrown off by that word to say relational database, but I mean the transmission of information between between me and you, between all of the people in our social networks, our projection into into the future, into the past. This kind of relational database, although not based in anything else in nature other than the fact that we're a eusocial species. That's how I would characterize a part of consciousness that doesn't seem to get as much airplay in terms of like a descriptive sort of power or descriptive language, right? And so yeah, what I mean, am I on the right track with focusing on the pluralistic entanglement based, in the area of eusociality?
Yeah, exactly. The I think the word eusociality, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not 100% sure how you're using it, but that's the concept that individuals are individual organisms like human beings and dogs and many others are both genetically predisposed and then environmentally taught to cooperate together, and at the larger level to show evidence of being able to feel for someone else and to be able to, whether it's monkeys grooming each other or birds having sentinels that that will put themselves at risk for the benefit of the group. Those principles have emerged in various life forms, and that eusociality is almost a shared consciousness of some sort. It's a set of behaviors that the individuals may not be entirely aware of, but as a group, it contributes to the positive evolutionary success of the group. So very powerful, and it's been evolving and developing into life forms as they have continued to evolve. Yes, that is an example of a form of entanglement between those individuals in that group. But entanglement, and another example of, say, we talk about the fact that human beings learn language, and they learn how to deal with other people. Well, that's a process that only works in a community where the individual is able to be taught. And so that individual who develops over a period of time into an adult human being, for example, has relations to every human being with whom that individual has interacted in the course of its lifetime. So the individual is fundamentally entangled to everybody else in that environment. So it's not the technical use of the term entanglement from quantum physics, but it's an analog of how each individual human is linked to, in a relational sense, with every other human being. And then you can expand that, because those genetic predispositions are a result of evolutionary factors over biological time, through all of the species that have come before. And so we have a relation to all of that. So that's, again, an entanglement. And by the way, it's an entanglement that is outside of time, in the sense that, you have a relationship to that past that is embodied in your existence. So in a certain sense, you have a relationship to something that doesn't exist anymore in physical reality. It's part of the distant past. It's not part of the present, but you have a relationship to it. So that is analogous to entanglement in a quantum physics sense, where you have paired particles that may be in different parts of the universe, but they have a shared history that determines a part of their makeup. And if you kind of expand that, think about, the Big Bang, when there was a homogeneous unit of the universe. And from that point, an explosion, to use that analogy of the Big Bang, into a process of evolution of the universe to the point where it is the universe that we know it is today. And you can think about the history and trajectory of any individual particle and how that came about, and the quantum physics that came about that entangled that particle to other particles that are elsewhere in the universe today. So even though that history is, however many billions of years in the past, there's a sense that the reality we live in today, our own minds, our own bodies, have an entanglement with that past. So that's a very, very, it's a bit of a mystical way of thinking about entanglement, but it expresses the idea that, our conscious minds can actually grasp this level of entanglement, and they're brought into the world physically through a process, and then they are changed through their interaction. And so every one of those pieces of past history is somehow embodied in the human being that is on the planet today.
Yeah. And the problem is that you try and explain that to certain people, and it's naturally taken as we're kind of describing it in metaphor in a way, right? We're using some of that, like there's some reality to it, but the person that's quick to judge is going to dismiss it as non-essential because they imagine it as some sort of matrix that's connected with some sort of like central, you could control everybody, like we're some sort of like the connectivity is something that is controllable or something like this. And it's frustrating to hear that kind of a response, because I realize that it's just complete left turn. It's not even a proper response to that point, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the relational, you use the word relational database. I think this is a factual presentation of the concept of interconnection.
Yeah.
And if you take that concept and you expand it out, it gets pretty extreme.
Yeah.
So, and this is where there's an organization called Science and Non-Duality. It's a pretty interesting group based out in California, and they would sort of take the proposition that yes, there is a dualism apparent in the universe, but that dualism is also part of a universal connectedness or a oneness. So it's science and what's called non-duality. So we experience life as dualisms, and yet at the same point there's a way of looking at it that is unitary or non-dual. And I think this concept of entanglement is a good one, because we live independent lives. This autonoetic consciousness that I have up here and that you have in your brain, is independent. And yeah, you can be a solipsist.
Yeah.
You can be a solipsist if you want, and there's no way to disprove that.
I love that.
But if you think about the entanglement that each of these brains have to the body, and to the other humans that have come before, and ultimately to the life forms that have come before, and then ultimately to the chemistry and the physics, that got created after the Big Bang. All right, now we're non-dual. We're dealing with a non-dual feature. And part of the difficulty of the consilience that I'm looking for is there's this inherent dualism, and it exists everywhere. And science is really good at exploring those and, taking things apart and looking at how they work. Not so good at putting them back together again in a conception about reality that is non-dual and understands the sense of the entanglement that exists. And sometimes it's easier to get to those conceptions through mystical or religious language, which is why I brought Omar Khayyam into this essay, this very practical essay on physics and cosmology and mathematics, because sometimes it's a little easier to grasp. There was one, I don't know if this story is of much use to this audience, but I was in a choir, a church choir, and 250 individuals, a Unitarian church. I just my wife and I like to sing, so we were part of that.
Are we going to get you to sing on the show here?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But he was. There were a lot of people in this Unitarian group that were they're secular and don't like to talk about God, and that sort of stuff. And so we're singing a gospel song, a religious song about Jesus and the concept of the drinking of the Eucharist ceremony. And so he said, well, I know some of you don't want to believe in this, but this is gospel after all. We have to sing this. And oh, by the way, if you look, there is a distinct positive probability, non-zero probability, that the water in the glass that you're drinking to bring into part of your body was in the body of Jesus.
Oh, that's entanglement if we ever had one right there. George, I think that's a perfect summary to wrap it up, because we're getting to the top of the hour, and I couldn't be happier with today's. I think we gave plenty to talk about. We could stay on chapter 4 next week too if we wanted. There's a few more points I'd like to bring up, and I think there's some more air miles that we can get out of this.
Yeah, what's beautiful about E.O. Wilson's work is that he puts things out there in a way that you can start asking these questions. He probes. Yeah. He's willing to risk speculations. He's willing to expose his beliefs. He doesn't always admit that they're beliefs, but he's willing to expose them and put them out there. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate. I mean, I disagree with him about certain things, but I really, really appreciate his his work and his writing, and what a great mind he is.
Right on.
He's got a good heart.
Yeah. George, it's been a pleasure again. And for all the viewers, let's tune in next week for another episode of Spiral Inquiry and Planksip. So Consciousness and Consilience is the name of the episode, and George Gantz is the superstore.
Oh, well, thank you for coming. No, you did. You asked the questions. You probed.
All right. Thanks, George. Talk to you later.